Hey everyone, it's Mustafa, second year medical student, and today I'll have my friend Yaeesh come in and talk about how he scored in the 94th percentile on the MCAT. He also taught one of the major prep courses for the MCAT for a couple years, so his insight is very valuable and I hope you guys get a lot out of it. So let's roll to the intro.
Hey everyone, I'm Yaeesh. I'm a plastic surgery resident at McMaster University and I completed my medical school at Dalhousie University in Nova Scotia. I also did my undergraduate degree at Dalhousie in neurosciences and I went to high school in Cape Breton. That's actually where I met Mustafa, whose channel this is, and we got together talking about ways that we can help people thinking about going into medical school. What we found is that information and people coming to us for advice often had no idea about what the application process looked like, and they found processes like the MCAT quite daunting. We knew that there's preparatory courses available, but these can be exorbitantly expensive, and we wanted to make something available for everyone to be able to use in order to prepare yourself for the process and getting some insider information as to what it entails. I've gone through this whole process myself, from finishing high school to doing an undergraduate degree to applying to medical school after writing my MCAT and then going through medical school and getting into a residency. I've also had the unique opportunity to teach a large preparatory MCAT course for 3 summers where there were about 120 students in front of me 4 times a week whilst I gave lectures on different courses. With this in mind, I do have some insights as to, the tips and tricks that were beneficial for the MCAT, and I also was scored in the 94th percentile when I wrote the MCAT myself. The MCAT is a marathon of an exam. It's 6 hours, 15 minutes, and it's broken down into 4 different sections. The sections include chemistry and physics, critical analysis and reasoning, which is equivalent to the old verbal reasoning aspects, biology and biochemical foundations, which is organic chemistry, and finally psychological, social, and behavioral sciences, which is a large component of psychology and sociology. So I just want to break down these 4 different sections into the actual number of questions that fall into each of the different topics. The largest part of the exam is CARS, so your critical analysis and reasoning skills makes up approximately 53 questions of the total. Physics has about 15 questions, biochemistry 30, biology 45, general chemistry is about 20, organic chemistry is 11, psychology is 38, and sociology is 18. So with all of this in mind, you have 4 different sections and you have passages in each of these sections that correspond to the different topics and subject matters at hand. The other thing to remember is that people often talk about timing of when to write the MCAT as being important for your final score. And by this I don't mean if you write it between 2nd or 3rd year or 3rd and 4th year, but the actual time of the year. There's a lot of speculation that at different times of the year there may be applicants that are scoring lower that are writing the exam, and because the exam is graded on a bell curve, that you may be more likely to score highly if you wrote it in January or February as opposed to in the summer when most people are doing this exam. This is technically not true because of the way that the bell curves are formed for the MCAT exam. Instead of it being representative of a single test day, it is rather a cumulative average of multiple test days where various applicants are writing the exam, and it's then standardized according to that. For example, if in a particular cohort on a day there were applicants that may have not scored as well on this exam before and they were rewriting the exam, even if you score highly relative to those people, that test will still be averaged over multiple test days and it will balance out on average. You should therefore write the MCAT when you have availability to study and when you can prepare for the exam adequately. When it comes to studying for the MCAT, you should have between 6 to 8 weeks of dedicated time in which you can focus on the exam exclusively. This is important for a few reasons, the most being that you need that time in order to absorb the information and to actually keep everything fresh so that when it comes to test day, you have the material on hand memorized that's required, and you can apply skills that you've learned in those preceding weeks to the actual exam. There's different ways of approaching how to study for the exam. People are different and everyone studies in unique ways. The important thing to try and understand is what study habits work for you. There's two broad categories that I found that people use in order to study for the exam. There's some people who are largely self-motivated and regimented to a daily schedule who are able to self-schedule their study time appropriately in order to prepare. A concept called the rule of eights is something that I adhere to and that I try to use when studying for my MCAT exam. The rule of eights is this. In a 24-hour day, you try to break up your day into thirds, 8 hours each. 8 hours is reserved for sleeping and rest. 8 hours is also reserved for recreational things such as cooking, cleaning, doing chores around the house, having social time. And 8 hours is used in order to study or to go about your workday. If you can apply this to a normal 9-to-5 job, it's very easy to also apply it to when you're studying. It's just you have to think about work as being your job for that day, and you have to be dedicated in order to achieve that. This takes me back to my initial point. So some people are able to do this by themselves and they can create study schedules that reflect this without having a regimented schedule designed by a preparatory course. Others need the accountability to be part of a particular course. So there's many that are offered, including those by Prep 101, Kaplan, Princeton Review, that allow you to have a pre-designed schedule that will make sure that you hit all of the different learning points required to have a comprehensive knowledge base for your MCAT exam. You need to decide what works for you, and there is no right answer as to one being better than the other. When I studied for my exam, I actually self-regimented and I studied for it on my own schedule that I created. I did use textbooks from a study course in order to make sure that I went over all the necessary topics, but I created the schedule and the timings on my own. So each day is important to have those rule of eights applied to it and to make sure you're getting the necessary output and studying done on a day-to-day level. But you also need to create an overarching schedule that plans out those 2 months ahead of time. What I mean by this is you need to look at all the different topics that I listed initially and decide which subjects you may require more time on and which subjects you may require less time on. Another important strategy here is to look at the breakdown and see which topics have higher values associated to them and to appropriately spend your studying time on those topics according to their significance. The way that I approached this was that I found that if I was starting on a particular topic, say for example biology, I wanted to go through all the relevant chapters for biology. I would spend my time either 1 or 2 days on each chapter and then do the practice questions associated with that chapter before moving on to the next section. I would then go about completing all the biology sections in that same manner before moving on to chemistry and then organic chemistry. I found in this way that I was able to keep my knowledge fresh as to the previous topics, and then it was easy for me to review those topics as it related to the next chapters in those particular subjects. In this way, I would have had a 3 or 4 week study schedule where all of the different subject matters in the textbooks from the course review companion I used was covered, so that I would have the remaining 2 to 4 weeks available to just exclusively do practice exams. These study skills are extremely important when it comes to not only your MCAT exam, but later on in your medical career when you continue to write demanding exams that are 6 to 8 hours in nature. The most recent ones that I've completed are my USMLE exams as well as my Canadian LMCC exams, which were equivalent times and as demanding in terms of the preparation and the skills and habits required in order to be successful on them. When in medical school, I also had the opportunity to teach one of the preparatory courses for the MCATs. And I think there was valuable skills that I myself learned from being in front of over 100 students 3 or 4 times a week. There's important techniques and tricks that some of these courses take time to really ingrain in your approach to an exam that can be beneficial. The most important of these that I found is that the MCAT can be a standalone exam that does not require you to necessarily have background information. The background studying for each of these different topics is incredibly useful and can make answering certain questions from passages easier, which is why I highly suggest that. But the actual passages and the questions can provide you all the information and skills necessary for you to use your own critical analysis skills to come up with the answers. With that being said, care needs to be taken to be extremely meticulous in the way that you read these passages, and that you are constantly analyzing and reanalyzing the motifs and themes that are being presented in these passages. What you need to do is you need to be constantly evaluating the information that's presented based on information that you've already read, and you need to summarize as you're going along to make sure you're understanding the passages and individual paragraphs that exist there. If you do this and you have a good understanding of the passage, when it comes to the questions, you can use a lot of this information to narrow down on answer choices. The other trick to remember is some of the questions present you with more information that's not actually within the passage stem, that causes you to reevaluate certain elements of your understanding. You need to be very dynamic in this analysis and be willing to change and respond to new information in order to best respond to the specific question being asked in a question stem. The other skill that's important is that in an answer where there's 4 different options that you have, your ability to narrow down answer choices by eliminating extreme answers or answers with wording that doesn't fit what the passage talked about becomes very useful. If you're able to narrow down an answer from 4 choices to 2, your odds of picking a right answer has doubled from 25 to 50%, which is quite substantial. And if you can do that for most questions on the exam, a 50% chance of getting a right answer becomes more powerful over the course of the entire exam. There's 2 stages to studying for this exam. The first is preparing your background information and solidifying your core foundational concepts. But the second part, which arguably I think is more important, is being able to do tons and tons of practice exams. What I did when I studied for the exam was I did 4 weeks of core material review, followed by 4 weeks of actually just doing practice exams. In the first 2 weeks of doing my practice exams, I would just do them by biology or physics sections, so by topic, rather than doing full-length exams. In this way, I looked at particular sections that I may have been weaker at, and then I would go back and review concepts that I found that I was doing poorly on. I was able to identify where my strengths were and then adjust my studying accordingly to do more practice tests in sections that I was weak at and less in those that I was feeling confident at. By the final 2 weeks of my preparation, I did full-length exams to completely simulate what an exam day would be like. I think 50% of this exam is overcoming the mental anguish that goes along with writing a 6-hour marathon of an exam. The only way that we get better at these exhausting tasks is by practicing it, by replicating what those conditions are, and training our body to cope with those types of stresses. The way that I would challenge each of you to practice for those exams is to get full-length practice exams and to set your breaks and the timing duration for each of those sections exactly the same as it would be on your exam day. The other part that's important is your habits that correspond to studying, and this includes getting a good night's sleep, having your study snacks and the snacks that you would have on exam day at hand to see what gives you mental energy to continue persevering through that exam, and finding strategies to reorient yourself and becoming mindful of the exam that you're in so that you're not spending time blanking out and not focusing on your questions, but you're able to refocus your thoughts so that you can be productive in that exam. I think this is the most challenging part for the actual exam taking, and many people have the skills and background and the knowledge to answer the questions, but it's being able to focus during that whole exam that sets you apart from getting an average mediocre score to scoring exceptionally highly. To summarize the core concepts that we discussed in this video, number 1, we talked about what the MCAT entails and the different topics and sections included and how many questions are in each of those sections. Number 2, we talked about the way that the MCAT is scored and if there's any strategic advantage to writing the exam at a particular time. Number 3, we talked about good study habits and the duration that you require in your schedule in order to appropriately prepare for the exam. Number 4, we talked about separating your studying time in both a foundational knowledge phase of getting information about the topics, but then also spending a large amount of time doing practice exams, simulating the actual exam day, and then preparing yourself mentally for the challenges that you face on that day. Finally, number 5, we talked about tips and tricks that I learned from instructing a large MCAT preparatory course that will best equip you for writing the exam and your approach to analyzing both the passage and the question stems to help narrow down answers and make your odds of picking a right answer greater.